Hi, I'm Nate Seberg, and this is One Day Ahead. Welcome to One Day Ahead. This is Great Gatsby in 45 minutes. Reading it for real is a 2.5-hour adventure, so grab some popcorn and buckle up, because this summary will give you everything you need to know in 1/3 the time. If you don't have 45 minutes, check out The Great Gatsby in 5 minutes, linked below. You'll get all the major beats, and then you will get on with your life. What this video really is a stitching together of all those summary sections from my longer Gatsby series. That series has more analysis, it's got key quotes and characters and these pithy summaries. So if somehow 45 minutes just isn't enough, or you want to go more in depth on those themes or characters, check that out for sure. Finally, I do have a teaching unit for educators synced to all of this stuff, link below, and a couple of other books besides. All right, enough of that. Let's start by diving into The Great Gatsby, Chapter 1. So 30-year-old Nick Carraway opens the book by saying that whenever he encounters behavior others might criticize, his daddy taught him to consider the advantages you've had. He goes on saying, in consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments. As a narrative device, this is a good move, because over the next 198 pages, our boy Nick here is going to be hanging out with some really terrible people, or at least people making terrible choices, Gatsby the Great included. If Fitzgerald didn't have us looking through the empathetic, non-judgy eyes of Nick here, I think I would legit hate every last person in this book. Nick helps soften him up. So what might not be clear here is that Nick is writing at the end of a timeline that we're about to cover. All the stuff that happens later in the text, this Nick has already lived through. And whatever he lived through, it has him pretty shaken up. It's like his whole life is spinning. He says that now he just wants the world to be in uniform, and at a sort of moral attention forever. So whatever it was bad. The only thing he seems sure of is a man named Gatsby, a guy who he says had an extraordinary gift for hope. He continues, no, Gatsby turned out all right in the end, which if you've read this book before and you think about it for like even a second, he does not. But Nick continues, it's what preyed on Gatsby. What foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interests in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. With that beautiful and slightly ominous line as our backdrop, Nick jumps back to the beginning of his narrative, and now we're off and running. So it seems Nick originally came to New York to sell bonds. He's new to this, but it's the 1920s, so why not? Over the next few pages, we learn about East and West Egg, two neighborhoods about 20 miles outside of New York. East Egg is old money. It's snooty, stuck-up, decadent, and lame, while West Egg is new rich. It's also decadent, but way more awesome. They face each other across a bay, and this will come up later. Things really get going when my boy Nick here heads to the mansion of Tom and Daisy Buchanan on East Egg. Daisy is Nick's cousin. She's flirty, coy, fun, and engaging, while Tom, by all accounts, is a world-class dumpster fire. This guy sucks. Nick describes him as a man who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything after savored of anticlimax. Listen, if your life has peaked at 21, you need to get yourself some new goals. On page 10, Nick describes Tom as a powerful former football player. He talks about his glistening boots, his great pack of muscles, the effeminate swank of his riding clothes, and his cruel, cruel body. If you find this description to be vaguely sexual, so do I. The only other character is Daisy's friend, the androgynously named Jordan Baker, a famous golfer. When Jordan learns that Nick here just moved to New Money West Egg, she asks if he knows Gatsby. Daisy perks up at the name, but before Nick could reply that Gatsby's his neighbor, dinner is announced. Rich people apparently announce their dinner, I assume with a gong. So the dinner sucks. As servants wait on them, Tom sets off on this rant about how the Nordic race, them, created everything worth having and thus need to keep the inferior races down. All the while, no one at this dinner has ever actually made anything, and I regret not putting air quotes around inferior races. Right when most readers are starting to think, hey, this book is not very good, something interesting happens. The phone rings. Students are always surprised to learn they had telephones in the 1920s, but yeah, it turns out they did. They were big, clunky, and metal, but they did have them. Siri too. Tom ducks out to take the call. Daisy follows him outside, and after a moment, Nick and Jordan can hear the couple having a muffled shouting match on the other side of the door. So what's going on? Okay, keep up. Jordan informs Nick that Tom, the dumpster fire, has a lady friend in New York. This is not a friend who happens to be a lady. This is a lady friend. What's worse, Daisy knows about it. Yikes. Tom and Daisy come back into the room and it's super awkward, but Daisy keeps smiling and laughing like there's nothing wrong. And she keeps this act up as the phone rings again and again. I couldn't guess what Tom and Daisy were thinking, but I doubt even Miss Baker was able to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. I'll say it again. Yikes. After dinner, Nick and Daisy go off together, and she tells the story about the birth of her daughter. She says she, her daughter, was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, though, I think we can guess. After she finds out it's a girl and cries about that fact for a while, she says, "All right, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." So, feminism. The chapter closes with Nick getting home and sitting outside for a while. Suddenly, he sees his neighbor come out of his ridiculous mansion. After a moment, the neighbor, who Nick rightly assumes is Gatsby, reaches his hand out across the water, trembling slightly. Nick looks across the bay to see what he's trying to, use the force on, but he doesn't see anything except for a single green light at the end of a dock across the bay. And that's a summary. So chapter 2 opens with our boy Nick, talking about the Valley of Ashes. It's a charming little spot between New York and the Eggs. As its name suggests, it's a place where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally with the transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. So that's lovely. The ashes are a byproduct presumably of New York City, and on an abstract level, Fitzgerald introduces this place to show that the booming fever pace of the 1920s, with its forgotten morals and uninhibited quest for money, has a hidden but very real cost. So only the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg see this injustice. They're actually eyes on an old faded billboard that overlook the valley, and they see everything and they watch unblinkingly. So in case you are missing the very subtle symbolism here, TJ's eyes represent the eyes of God. And as far as symbols goes, this one's a little on the nose. We quickly discover that Tom and Nick are taking the train to New York. Nick to take in the city and Tom to, kick children. However, as they stop at the bridge in the Valley of Ashes, Tom grabs Nick by the elbow and quite literally forces him off the train. They're going to go meet Tom's mistress, Myrtle, but they first run into her husband, the anemic but painfully honest Wilson. He owns a garage and he thinks he is this close to buying a car off Tom. Nick describes Myrtle as having an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. They get Wilson out of the room and they make a plan to get Myrtle to New York. All the while, Nick just stands there stupidly. Next thing you know, they've met up in the city, and after stopping to buy Myrtle a dog, they head to Tom's city apartment so that Tom and Myrtle can, Nick wants to leave because, who wouldn't? But they peer pressure him into staying by calling up some friends for a party. It turns out it's just people getting drunk, there's a difference, but there it is. Of the friends, the only two that matter are Myrtle's sister, Catherine, and a man named Chester McKee. Nick says Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat that's an apartment below. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer. So for those of you keeping score, Nick just described him as being a rather effeminate man with artistic sensibilities. Folks, this is 1920s code for homosexuality. McKee is a photographer, and since portraits required a great deal of planning and care, they're often referred to and are referred to here as studies. They're considered art at the time, and so they have names and things. They talk about studies at the party, and you'll be lost for 3 pages if you don't know this. And speaking of the party, it sucks. Whiskey keeps going around the room, and Nick partakes heavily, writing, "I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon." So everything that happens has a dim haze cast over it. The only exception is Catherine, who says she feels just as good on nothing at all. During the course of the party, we learn how Tom and Myrtle met. It's boring. We also learn the only reason Tom and Myrtle can't get married right away is Tom claims Daisy is Catholic and then can't get a divorce. This, of course, is a lie, because Tom, of course, is a dumpster fire. As the evening drags on, something strange happens to Nick. He writes, "I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets. And I was him, too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without." At some point around midnight, the wheels finally come off. Nick writes, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson, that's Myrtle, stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson, still Myrtle, had any right to mention Daisy's name. Daisy, 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 shouted Miss Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy. Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Chester had been dozing in a chair, but the chaos that follows this move is enough to wake him up, and he sees the blood and screaming as his cue to go to bed. And Nick, well, to understand what happens next, we need to move to our next segment. Let's really get to the crux of it here, Nick. When Chester leaves the party, you exit with him. In the elevator, with the elevator operator standing there, he invites you to lunch sometime. Then we get something very interesting. We get ... So it's actually called an ellipse, but whatever. That's how the kids say it, and I'm down with the kids. I've seen a meme. So ... That's international sign for I've left something out. What'd you leave out there, Nick? Following the elevator scene, we get a cryptic fragment. ... I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brooklyn Bridge. Those are the names of Chester's studies, aren't they? And it's Chester sitting up in bed. Nick, I get that it's 1920s America, that you can't live openly as a gay or bisexual man. I get that. But my concern isn't that you're lying to us. It's that you might be lying to yourself. If you cannot be honest about something as foundational as your sexuality, if you need to speak in half-truths and riddles, if you need to fracture your life into being within and without, if you need to hedge your bets by saying you were drunk so everything that happened had a dim haze cast over it, then how can we trust that the story you're telling us is even true? Now add this. The central character of this story, Gatsby, is someone you already described using the word gorgeous on the second page of the book. I feel for you, Nick. I wish you could just be you. But man, if this story is going to end up with you hating everyone from the East, except for this one guy who you call gorgeous, who just happens to be a gajillionaire, well, you're going to need to forgive me if I take your account with a grain or a barrel of salt. With love, Nate. Chapter 3 kicks off with Nick running us through a typical party at his neighbor Gatsby's mansion. You get the sense that he's describing a party as seen from the outside, like he's spending a lot of time looking out of windows and creeping behind curtains. But by all accounts, the parties do sound awesome. The famous and the hip flock from New York, playing on the beach all day before cutting loose at night. Nick clearly wants to go, but he's the awkward new kid, and he hasn't actually met Gatsby. Anyway, someone must have noticed Creeper McGee here, because one day a butler shows up with an invitation from Gatsby. At the party that night, Nick shows up alone, which has got to be uncomfortable. He really gets hung up on the fact that he was invited and keeps bringing it up with everybody he meets. When he can't take this lonely awkwardness any longer, Nick turns to the sweet, sweet refuge of alcohol. I was on my way to getting roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment. We call these coping skills, but thankfully, my boy Nick does eventually find rescue when he mercifully runs into Jordan Baker. Remember her? They met in chapter 1. She was the aloof golfer friend of Daisy. Hello, I roared, advancing towards her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. Listen, Nick says he was on his way to getting roaring drunk, but when your first thought is, wow, I sound loud, you've arrived. Jordan is as cool and aloof as ever, but she does let Nick tag along throughout the night, even taking him back to meet her escort for the evening, who he describes as a persistent undergrad given to violent innuendo. That means sex jokes, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later, Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Ah, young love. So the talk at the party is all speculation about their host, and confusion reigns. Some thinks that Gatsby was a German spy during the war. That would be the Great War or World War I, the last war that humanity would ever have. Some think that he killed a man, and others that he was in the American army. What's interesting, however, is that all this rumor spreading about Gatsby is done on the hush. Nick has this great line. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired, that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world. We still don't know much about Gatsby at this point, but it seems clear that he is a man of great wealth who has, for some reason, surrounded himself with freeloaders, sycophants, and party crashers, many of whom he's never actually met. Really makes you wonder why. Nick and Jordan go in search of their host, ending up in a grand library where they happen upon Owl Eyes. Great name. He's drunk and marveling at something that will take some explanation. Owl Eyes is dumbfounded by the fact that the books in Gatsby's library are real. So stay with me here. It turns out that back in the day, and right now on Amazon, you can buy fake cardboard books. It was an inexpensive way to fill out your library. They look all impressive and regal on the outside, but inside, they're empty. If you're starting to think, hey, this might be a metaphor, definitely go with that instinct. The idea is you'll have the appearance of literary well-roundedness without going to the trouble of actually acquiring all those books. The modern equivalent would be buying followers on Instagram or Twitter, which my students assure me is a thing. But Gatsby's books are real. As Owl Eyes will tell you, they have pages and everything. So far, things are looking pretty good for our boy Gatsby. He's got lots of books, and his books are books. But hold on. Having words in them is not all that Owl Eyes is stunned by. Saying Gatsby knew when to stop too, didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect? Again, I'm so sorry, but stay with me. In those days, publishers would print several pages on one large sheet of paper, which they would then fold up multiple times into what's called a signature. Stack multiple signatures, add some glue, a binding, and some sewing, and you've got yourself a book. The deal is, because things got all origami in that first step, a first-time reader would actually need to cut along the outer signature folds to release some individual pages. But Gatsby's pages, critically, are uncut, meaning his books are real, but he's never actually read them. Nick and Jordan return to the party, where Nick is engaged by a stranger who says he remembers meeting him in the war. They make small talk for a bit, and the stranger offers to take Nick up in his hydroplane, meaning this, not that, in the morning. Nick tells the man that he was invited, but that he hasn't met the host yet. The man is bewildered for a moment before blurting out, "I'm Gatsby." It's awkward until Gatsby turns on his smile. Nick writes, "He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it. It concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself." Or, in visual form, Nick really does like that smile. The party carries on. At some point, Jordan is plucked from the throng to have a private discussion with Gatsby. When she reemerges, she's all in a tizzy, but she won't say why. Finally, the night ends, and as Gatsby ushers them out the door, he reminds Nick of their upcoming hydroplane ride, employing his trademark phrase, "old sport." You'll notice Nick never actually agreed to go with Gatsby, but apparently Gatsby's a quick judge of character. The chapter ends with Nick talking about how he wants to date Jordan, but how it feels dishonest because of that vague relationship thing he's got going on back home. It came up in chapter 1. He brags, "Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I've ever known." Which, as we know from last week, is only kind of true. And that's the summary. So chapter 4 opens on an unnamed young woman drinking Gatsby's liquor from Gatsby's crystal on Gatsby's beach, all the while trading in the salacious rumors that surround her host. She claims he's a bootlegger, meaning he sells alcohol, something recently made illegal with the passage of Prohibition, and that he killed a man who found out he was nephew to von Hindenburg. Oh, could she be referring to Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Breckendorf and von Hindenburg? That's his full name. He's German. Hindenburg was the supreme commander of the German military during World War I, and then he was elected president after the war. How'd that turn out for the world? Oh, he went on to appoint Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Awesome. Admittedly, he did that under pressure. All right, so you might associate his name with this, but he didn't build that. They just named it after him. Next, we get a few pages of Nick listing off the people who came to Gatsby's party. You should skip it. Jump back in when Gatsby turns up at Nick's place and announces, "You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." As they drive to New York, Gatsby suddenly breaks out unprompted with his entire life story. You know, like you do. To Nick, the story sounds stale and rehearsed. He says, "With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare, they evoked no image." According to Gatsby, he was raised in San Francisco in considerable wealth before being educated at Oxford. But now, everyone's dead and Gatsby has their money. He claims to have spent the time after college traveling around Europe like a young Raja and trying to forget something very sad that happened to him a long time ago. Something very sad. Worse than everyone you know dying? But that's not all. Next, Raja Gatsby is pulled into World War I, where he won a medal from every Allied government, including Little Montenegro. Nick doesn't believe a word, which explains his shock when Gatsby produces an authentic medal from Little Montenegro with the inscription Major J. Gatsby for valor extraordinary. Next, he produces a photo from his Oxford days, and like Nick, we're left wondering 1, why he carries this crap around with him, and 2, what is actually true about this guy. The rest of the drive is eventful, but not important to the plot. They pass Myrtle in the Valley of Ashes, Gatsby gets pulled over but has a "I'm rich so there are no consequences for me" card, and Nick treats us to some old-fashioned racism on 73. Good times. Things pick back up when they arrive at a speakeasy, where they meet Meyer Wolsheim. Almost immediately after they first meet, Wolsheim turns to Nick and says, "I understand you're looking for a business connection." Nick has no idea what this means, and neither do most readers until they hear it aloud. Connection is obviously gangster for connection. Gatsby jumps in, "Oh no, this isn't the man. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that another time." So this exchange shows us that our boy Gatsby is in some sort of business arrangement with Wolsheim, a notorious gangster. So, file that away. During lunch, we learn that Wolsheim thinks highly of Gatsby and that his cufflinks are made from the finest specimen of human molar. That's disgusting, but I do like that they're the finest specimen. Like, he took the time to examine them for tartar buildup and passed over some other ones. So they talk and eat for a while before Tom Dumpster Fire Buchanan spots Nick from across the room and comes to say hello. Introductions are made and Gatsby looks suddenly strained and embarrassed. Next thing you know, he's just gone. So from there, the chapter makes a big jump. Now it's later in the day and Nick is having tea with Jordan Baker. It's still Nick writing, but now it's Jordan's story and Jordan's words. In short, when Jordan was in her teens, she once saw Daisy with a strapping young lieutenant named, wait for it, J. Gatsby. There's some evidence they fell in love, but her family disapproved, and at around the same time, Gatsby was shipped off to the war. A year later, Daisy has her societal debut? I don't care. It's a rich girl, I'm growing up now, come marry me thing. And it totally works, because 3 months after the war is over, she's engaged to Tom, and 4 months after that, the night before her wedding, Daisy receives a letter. It never says who it's from, but come on. It's from Gatsby. After reading the letter, Daisy has a meltdown. She gets wildly drunk, throws away Tom's wedding gift, and keeps repeating, "Tell him how Daisy changed your mind." So things get bad. This is not cute crying. We're in ugly cry territory. So Jordan's a bridesmaid, and with the help of a chambermaid, they get Daisy into a cold tub to sober her up. And a half hour later, they have her dressed and downstairs. The next day, she marries a burning pile of garbage. I mean Tom. So it's a rough start, but then everything seems fine. According to Jordan, they're in love. They honeymoon. They start a life together. That is, until Tom is in a car wreck that makes the papers because someone with him was injured. That someone, the chambermaid from the wedding. We don't know the details of what comes next, but we do know Daisy and Tom stay together, have a kid, go to France, then Chicago, then come to New York. It seems that in all that time, Daisy had never once heard Gatsby's name until Jordan mentioned it back when Nick came over in chapter 1. When Daisy asks about it later, Jordan puts it together that Gatsby, the eccentric millionaire, is the same lieutenant from the car. So from there, the book jumps back to the present, because remember, Jordan is telling the story to Nick over tea. Nick says it's a strange coincidence. They both ended up on the eggs, and Jordan responds with the stunning, but it wasn't a coincidence at all. Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Finally, Jordan gets to the point of the tea. Jordan informs Nick that Gatsby asked Jordan to ask Nick to invite Daisy over for tea. The idea is that Gatsby can just happen to, pop by. We go on to learn that Gatsby has spent the last few years scouring the Chicago papers for Daisy's name, and that he throws all these parties because each night brought with it the slim yet tragic chance that she might attend. He was hoping she would just wander in one night. As the chapter closes, Nick is undecided on what to do. I think he knows that this request is insane, but also he has the constitution of a pool noodle. So rather than making up his mind, instead he sidesteps the question altogether. He says, unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding sides, and so I drew up the girl beside me. She smiled, and so I drew her up again, closer, this time to my face. So he ends the chapter not by making a decision, but by kissing Jordan. Interestingly, it's not clear from the text if he even likes her or if he simply wants the closeness of someone who is alive and owns a face. And that's the summary. So chapter 5 directly follows Nick's tea with Jordan, where she relays the story of Gatsby and Daisy's past. And it ends with a big ask from Gatsby. Invite Daisy to tea, so Gatsby can show up and the two can be reunited. For a little context, every decision Gatsby has made for the last 5 years has been guided by this singular goal. And now is the time dude decides to play it cool, saying, oh, That's all right. I don't want to put you in any trouble. And Nick is all like, no, really, I'll do it. And Gatsby's like, hey, okay, like if you want to. So in return, Gatsby proposes a little quid pro quo, saying, look here, old sport, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline. What he means is that it's illegal and that he's willing to cut Nick in on the action. But ever honest Nick turns down this pseudo bribe and the next day invites Daisy to tea. That morning, Nick gets up and realizes he had forgotten to tell his Finn to come back, so he drove to West Egg Village to search for her. If you're lost, and everyone is lost by this, that's his Finnish housekeeper. He mentioned her one time in chapter 1. On the day of the tea, Gatsby is a piano wire. While I'm sure he looked resplendent in his white flannel suit, he's described on a single page with derivatives of nervous, pale, sleepless, blank, vague, hollow, and vacant. So, not great. At precisely 3:58, 2 minutes before the tea is set to start, he storms for the door saying, no one is coming to tea, it's too late. Luckily, Daisy chooses this moment to arrive. So a quick note on Daisy. She is an attention-loving socialite who is fond of coy statements that make her seem fresh and fun, like her greeting, is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? So when she whispers to Nick, are you in love with me? Or why did I have to come alone? She does not want to get with her cousin. This is a joke. Same with her next line, come back in an hour, Ferdy. His name is Ferdy. It's funny. Well, I mean, not really. Anyway, they walk into the house and Nick is baffled to find the living room empty. Suddenly there's a knock on the door. Nick writes, I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. Evidently, Gatsby ran out the back door and circled around to the front. Nick continues, with his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. I mean, to him, it's kind of funny to me. So Nick stands frozen in the hallway as an awkward and absolute silence fills the house before it is mercifully broken by Daisy singing out, I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. Nick goes into the living room and thus begins the second time Nick has third-wheeled a date in this book. So I'll skip the particulars of their reunion other than to say it is a social train wreck that won't stop wrecking. For example, Gatsby catches a clock that he knocks over and then they can't seem to not talk about it. Daisy mentions that it's been a while since they've met, but then Gatsby ruins that progress by naming exactly how long it has been. And finally, Nick grasps on the thought of making tea when, and I love this, the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Finally, Nick just exits, leaving them space to say what needs to be said. When he returns, he finds the tension gone. The trio then decide to go on a tour of Gatsby's mansion. Now, I want to be clear here. I was against all of this from the start. Nick inviting Daisy to tea in the first place was a terrible life choice, but Nick going with them on the mansion tour? That's just ridiculous. So they do. They go on a tour of the mansion and Daisy is suitably impressed with the obvious markers of ostentatious wealth. In one room, they come across a man doing liver exercises, which evidently are a thing. His name is Klipspringer, and I only bring him up because he'll come up again later and so that I could talk about liver exercises, which I want to be clear, are a thing. Finally, they reach Gatsby's bedroom and it's a surprisingly simple affair, minus the toilet seat made of pure gold. Gatsby opens 2 large cabinets saying, I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season. Next, Gatsby began throwing them one by one before us, shirts which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in a many-colored disarray. The shirts mount higher and higher until suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. Because shirts? So obviously there's more going on here. Nick creeps around Gatsby's room and he finds a photograph of an old man named Dan Cody. Stay tuned on him. Finally, as Klipspringer plays the piano, Gatsby and Daisy hold hands and begin whispering to each other. They become so lost in their love-filled world that Nick realizes they hardly know he's there any longer. I looked once more at them and they looked back at me remotely, possessed by intense life. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. And that's the summary. So after some nonsense at the beginning, this chapter really has 3 distinct scenes. In scene 1, we finally get the straight story on Gatsby. So it turns out his real name is James Gatz, which I think we can all agree is not the kind of name you can have if you want to be a mysterious, aristocratic millionaire bachelor. The way Nick tells his story is a mixed up mess, but I'll put the events in chronological order for you. Gatsby was born in North Dakota to shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. Because of their humdrum lives, internally at least, Gatsby rejected them as his parents. He chose instead to literally reinvent his life from the ground up. So sometime in his teens, the persona of J. Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island sprang from his plutonic conception of himself. James Gatz leaves his parents at around 15 and heads off to a small Lutheran college in Minnesota. He makes it there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Evidently, he preferred a rambler's life to emptying trash cans and wiping up pee, because for the next year, he's transient, picking up odd jobs like digging clams and fishing salmon. We also learned that he knew women early, which, okay. Finally, fate intervenes. While walking along the beaches of Lake Superior, the now 17-year-old James Gatz sees a yacht over a shallow section of water that had a reputation for wrecking boaters. James borrows a rowboat, pulls out to the yacht, introduces himself as J. Gatsby, and informs the millionaire yacht owner Dan Cody of the danger. Cody's impressed with Jay. He takes him under his wing, and over the next 5 years, they travel the world. This time with Cody is Jay's education in high society and wealth. He acquires a certain measure of posh and sophistication. It's also due to Cody that he learns to leave liquor alone after one too many wild parties where women would rub champagne into his hair. When Cody dies, Jay emerges again penniless, but he was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of J. Gatsby had filled out into the substantiality of a man. Presumably next comes enlistment, meeting Daisy, Europe, the war, Little Montenegro, all that. So there you go, the real J. Gatsby story, finally. On 107, Nick pulls us from this regression back to the present, and we begin scene 2, Drinks with Tom. One Sunday afternoon, as Nick and Gatsby are hanging out, Tom Buchanan and some friends just drop in unannounced. Apparently rich people just show up at the homes of other rich people and they're rich together. All you need to know is that Gatsby gets just a touch aggressive with Tom, bringing up that he knows Daisy in a sort of hinty kind of way. It's enough so that Tom resolves to find out more by attending Gatsby's next party, and scene 3 is that party. Apparently it's just as robust and wild as ever, but this one, because it's attended by that dumpster fire, gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness. Nick continues, there were the same people, or at least the same sort of people, the same profusion of champagne, the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion. But I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Gatsby takes Daisy and Tom around, introducing them to notable guests and referring to Tom always as Mr. Buchanan, the polo player, which is funny. Daisy and Gatsby dance a surprisingly graceful and conservative foxtrot together, and at one point they sneak off. One assumes to make out after asking Nick to stand lookout in the garden, which, Nick, just say no one time in your life. Later, dinner is served, and Tom asks to eat with another group. Go ahead, answered Daisy genially. And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil. This may seem like more coy Daisy nonsense, and that's certainly there, but the next line reveals that there's more. She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty. So it's debatable, but I think this pencil thing is actually a subtle flex from Daisy. Tom is hitting on another girl, and Daisy, in a sort of veiled screw you, hands him a pencil to get her information. She's essentially saying, I might not be able to stop you, but don't think I don't know what you're doing. It's kind of awesome. So as the night is wrapping up, Tom rejoins Daisy and Nick and begins asking some questions. Who is this Gatsby anyhow? Demanded Tom suddenly. Some big bootlegger? Daisy rises to his defense, saying, I can tell you right now. He owns some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself. So, add that to the list of things we hear about Gatsby. After the revelry is finally over, Gatsby asks Nick to stick around. He is despondent. Daisy plainly didn't enjoy the party, and remember, all of this is for Daisy. It's here that we see more evidence of Gatsby's blind need to warp reality and control time in an effort to get to the Daisy he's built up in his head. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 4 years with that sentence, they could go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. Then we get perhaps the most famous line in the book. Nick, in an astonishing moment of almost courage, says, I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Gatsby replies with the tragically misguided, can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. And that's the summary. In Chapter 7, we get the showdown you knew was coming. Tom v. Gatsby for the love of Daisy. It all starts when Nick, Jordan, and Gatsby are invited to the Buchanans for lunch on a broiling hot day. They sit around and complain about the heat for a while, and then we get something cryptic. Gatsby's eyes floated towards Daisy. Ah, she cried, you look so cool. Their eyes met and they stared at each other alone in space. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. What? Told him she loved him? What? Listen, don't spend any time trying to figure this one out. It does not make sense. Daisy speaks in nonsense, but Tom can translate Daisy nonsense, and now he knows. And speaking of nonsense, Tom regains control by declaring rather hotly that they're all going to the city for the afternoon and that he and Gatsby will drive each other's cars for seriously no discernible reason. Gatsby's hesitant at first, saying there's not enough gas in his car, but Tom comes back with plenty of gas. And if it runs out, I can stop at a drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore nowadays. So, shots fired. Gatsby and Daisy take Tom's blue coupe, and Tom, Nick, and Jordan drive Gatsby's yellow circus wagon. During the drive, Tom puts together that Nick and Jordan already know about the affair. He is not pleased. At Jordan's insistence, they stop for gas at what turns out to be the very garage owned by Wilson and Myrtle. Here we learn that Wilson has discovered Myrtle's affair, but he hasn't yet figured out that it's with Tom. He declares that they're moving out west, and as they're talking, Nick's spidey senses something behind him. Looking back, he notices the eyes of Myrtle Wilson. She's looking through a window with jealous terror, but not at Tom. Her eyes are locked on Jordan Baker, who she assumes to be Tom's wife. So the crew get into New York and they rent rooms at the Plaza Hotel. Tom is not in a good place. He was feeling the hot whips of panic. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago, secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitously from his control. This state of mind helps explain the blow-up between him and Gatsby that follows. So it starts kind of catty, but before long, Tom goes right at it, saying, I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question. What kind of row were you trying to cause in my house anyhow? They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. The fight lasts for a few pages, but I'll give you some highlights. Tom goes on, I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from Nowhere make love to your wife. Daisy sides with Gatsby by calling Tom revolting and not denying the affair. Then Gatsby makes his play. Daisy, just tell him the truth, that you never loved him and it's all wiped out forever. Daisy first tries to dodge this request, but Gatsby needs this. He has to obliterate those 4 years. So he repeats himself. You never loved him. Daisy hesitates, but it was done now. It was too late. I never loved him, she said with perceptible reluctance. Hearing her tone, Tom smells blood in the water. He goes all puppy dog. Not in Kapiolani? Demanded Tom suddenly. Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? There was a husky tenderness in his tone. Daisy? Knowing Tom is right, Daisy cracks. Oh, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now. Isn't that enough? Which evidently Daisy has not been paying attention. So Gatsby decides to table the whole did the last 4 years even happen debate. He's all like, well, we'll come back to that. You don't understand, he says to Tom. Daisy's leaving you. Nonsense. I am though, she said with a visible effort. But now Tom sets to work, eroding the facade of Gatsby. He accuses him of bootlegging, names an associate Gatsby screwed over, and claims knowledge of a scam darker and bigger than all of his other schemes. Finally, Daisy breaks. She begs to leave, saying, please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Please, Tom. This fight is over. But Tom's a dumpster fire, and he wants to flaunt his triumph over Gatsby. You two start home, Daisy, said Tom, in Mr. Gatsby's car. He won't annoy you. I think he realizes his presumptuous little flirtation is over. They leave and the other three soon follow in Tom's blue coupe. So the great confrontation turns out to be almost nothing at all. It's disappointing really, but worry not. Nick manages to keep us turning pages with the final line of the scene. So we drove on towards death in the cooling twilight. As they drive from the city, the trio comes upon an accident at Wilson's garage. They stop to gawk, but Tom's excitement turns into horror as he sees Myrtle lying dead, the victim of a hit and run by a speeding yellow car. It seems she ran out into the road almost like she expected it to stop. Through his pain, Wilson suspects Tom, but Tom points to his blue coupe before pushing his way out of the crowd. On the drive home, Tom breaks down in tears. The goddamn coward, he whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. It's late when they arrive at the Buchanan mansion. They order Nick a taxi and he waits for it outside. Suddenly, Gatsby steps out from behind a bush because apparently this chapter will never end. Silence falls. After a moment, they discuss the accident, and Nick tells him that Myrtle is dead. Nick asks, how in the devil did it happen? Well, I tried to swing the wheel, he broke off, and suddenly I guessed at the truth. Was Daisy driving? Yes, he said after a moment. But of course, I'll say I was. Gatsby took the wheel following the accident, hid the car in his garage, and now was holding vigil in the garden to make sure Tom doesn't turn violent. Nick heads home, but Gatsby stays, standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. And that's the summary. Following the hotel room showdown, the vanquishing of Gatsby and the hit and run murder, and the reveal that Daisy was driving, Nick can't sleep. It's probably his mattress. He hears Gatsby arrive home at dawn and goes to chat with him. Nick encourages Gatsby to leave town for a couple of days, but evidently Gatsby didn't read chapter 7 because he still thinks Daisy is about to change her mind. So he's sticking around just in case. He rationalizes his way to it, saying, "You must remember, old sport, Daisy was very excited this afternoon, and the result was she hardly knew what she was saying." So that's dumb. The next few pages are spent filling in more details about their prior relationship. It's nice, but let's move this along. Finally, Nick has to go to work. It's hard to remember these people work, but he does. He sells mods. He promises to call around noon, and Gatsby says, "I suppose Daisy will call too." Nick leaves him, but before entering his house, he turns. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch of them put together." I've always been glad I said that. With Nick at work, the narrative switches back to the night before, to the garage, following the hit and run. Wilson is understandably in a dark place. His behavior and speech are erratic, but it's clear Wilson believes her death was no accident, that Myrtle ran out to speak with her lover and was murdered when he refused to stop. Wilson declares that he has a way of finding out who it was, and he leaves at dawn. Police are later able to piece together his movements throughout the morning, all except a 3-hour chunk they could not account for. But the upshot is this. By 2:30 that day, Wilson is in West Egg, asking for directions to a mansion owned by a guy named Gatsby. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby decides to go for a swim, something he hasn't done all summer long. He leaves instructions regarding the phone call that any minute now is definitely coming from Daisy and heads to the pool. Nick narrates no telephone message arrived, but the butler waited until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. Nick returns and, along with some staff, finds Gatsby floating dead in his pool, his blood mixing with the water and the fallen leaves. It's not until they start carrying him up towards the house that they find Wilson as well, lying in the grass, the victim of his own grief and gunshot. And that concludes chapter 8. Chapter 9 finds Nick at the center of Gatsby's funeral arrangements. He first tries to contact Daisy, but she and Tom have left or really fled town. Next, he reaches out to Wolfsheim, who refuses to come to the funeral. Wolfie says, "When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in it in any way. I keep out." Wolfsheim's office, by the way, is labeled the Swastika Holding Company, but don't read into this. When Fitzgerald wrote this, the Nazis weren't really a global thing yet. So Nick is striking out for his dead friend, but finally Gatsby's father appears. He's a cute old grief-stricken man who's read about his son's murder in the paper. Walking around the mansion, he shows awe and pride at what his son has accomplished. Gatsby's memorial is held at the house, but nobody comes. Then the sad little procession moves down to the cemetery, where only one other guest turns up. It's Owl Eyes, that drunk guy from the library. When he's told no one came to the house, he sums it all up perfectly. Why, my God. They used to go there by the hundreds. The poor son of a bitch. A few more disconnected things wrap up the book. Nick has a regression about taking the train west during school. I'm sure it's full of deep and resonant meaning, but I mostly don't get it. He also closes things up with Jordan Baker, who in a bit of relationship jujitsu suddenly claims to be engaged to some guy. She'll really do about anything to stay aloof and detached. That's kind of her jam. And finally, Nick encounters Tom in New York. Tom holds out his hand, but Nick does not. "What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me?" "Yes," Nick responds. "You know what I think of you." Wait, did Nick finally grow a backbone? "Tom," I inquired, "what did you say to Wilson that afternoon?" He stared at me without a word, and I knew I had guessed right about those missing hours. Missing hours refers to Wilson's movements on the day of the murder. Nick has guessed that Wilson visited Tom and that Tom gave him Gatsby's name as the driver of the yellow car. Tom responds hotly, "What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog, and he never even stopped the car." Nick narrates, "There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true." And as for no backbone, he does shake Tom's hand before leaving, but the text says that it seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. So Nick doesn't find courage per se, but he does reframe Tom as someone to pity, not confront. So, like baby steps. The book comes to an end with Nick readying to return west. He is, emotionally speaking, exactly where he started this book, disgusted with everyone and everything out east except Gatsby. He muses on wonder, hope, and the dream and promise of America. He brings us back to that moment Gatsby first picked out that green light, and the text concludes with these lines. "Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And that's the summary.